the live stream.
Yep, I'm clicking live. We're live.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the session on the Global Dynamics project, or the GID. Today, we are going to have 3 paper presentations from team members of the project. And I will start with an overview of what the project is.
Thank you very much for joining the session on the Global Dynamics project, or the GID.
No, you are not
Today
muted.
we are going to have 3 paper presentations from team members.
Oh, I apologize, everyone. I think there's something.
Overview.
There we go.
Apologies for the hiccup. We are living in a new world of technology that we are just learning how to use. So for those of us, for those of you just joining, let me restart. So I'm going to be starting with an overview of the Global Income Dynamics project. And after that, there will be 3 paper presentations from country team members, UK, Canada, and Argentina, right? So let me begin with the overview of what this project is about. So this is a joint initiative between Princeton University, Stanford, and University of Minnesota, and in particular, the MEBD Institute, which is the Minnesota Economics Big Data Institute. And there are 3 people, Gianluca Violante, Luigi Pistaferi, and myself, and we are co-leading this project. The goal is, this is a mouthful, so I will tell you, then I will expand on it. Our goal is to build an open access cross-country database with 4 characteristics. The first one is the statistics that we are going to be publishing are going to be harmonized. The statistics that we have will be rich micro statistics on individual and household earnings. They will be from administrative data, and they will be panel data. So these are the 4 key characteristics. When I say harmonized, the data from every country, the statistics are generated from one master code that was written for this project. It's a team effort. Serdar Özkan from University of Toronto and Sergio Salgado from Wharton. They have done the hard work of writing it, and they were minimally adapted to each country. So sometimes in these kinds of efforts, if the codes are written separately, some of the differences might be coming from that. And here we want to avoid that, so it will be one code running on every country. By administrative data, I think it's clear what we mean. I'm going to expand on the benefits of these in just a moment. So currently, there are 13 countries in the project. It's US, UK, Canada, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And there are 45 economists from these 13 countries spread across these teams. Just to give you an idea about the magnitude of the statistics we are talking about, there will be about 500,000 to more than 1 million statistics that we have currently for each country. And yesterday I was looking at one country, for example, Italy, which is typical in terms of the length of data we have available. There's more than 1.5 million statistics, and this is just basically what we have at this point. So it will be kind of very rich. It will allow researchers to use it for many purposes. That's our hope. The plan is to gradually expand the project to more countries. There's currently more than 10 countries who have expressed interest to join. We are hoping to finish the first stage soon. The project has been going on for 2.5 years, and we are hoping to launch the website and the database in early 2022. Now, let me give you some background. There are already some harmonized cross-country databases on cross-sectional income inequality, and many of you will know these. One, for example, is the World Inequality Database, which is started with the work of Atkinson, Piketty, and Sayers, and grew into like a big cross-country database. There's another one called the World Income Inequality Database at the United Nations University, and the OECD has a similar one called the Income Distribution Database. Now, in addition to those, there are also journal special issues. For example, the Review of Economic Dynamics published one in 2010. It was called Cross-Sectional Facts for Macroeconomists. There's a forthcoming detailed review also on inequality. So why this project then? There are three key differences, and we think like novel aspects of it that makes it valuable. So the existing cross-country databases, they are mostly based on survey data. They are mostly focused on cross-sectional aspects, and they are mostly aggregated. They are like either countrywide or they are for a few demographic kind of subgroups. What we want to extend this in this project is to use administrative data instead of surveys, to have panel data in every country. These are the requirements actually to be part of the project. And we go quite a bit deeper in the heterogeneity dimension. And I will give you a few examples in just a moment. So why administrative data? And this is well known to many of you. Survey data suffers from a number of issues. I mean, one, there is survey response error, measurement error, and it can be very large and pervasive. There's sample attrition. People basically leave the project, leave the data set, and it's often non-random. The second one is it's very hard to get the tails of distributions in surveys because people in the tails usually are less likely to respond. And the third one is, given where we are today in 2022, the sample size of surveys are looking increasingly very small, which makes it hard for statistical analysis, okay? Because sometimes you need to identify some very fine empirical fact that requires power, and it's difficult to do that. Administrative data, there's minimal survey, there's basically minimal measurement error. There's no survey response error, of course, and there is little or no attrition. The massive size makes it possible to do really granular analysis of subpopulations, and it allows you to calculate moments like higher order moments, the tails very accurately, and a lot of times that's really important. To give you an idea, suppose that for your project you want to compare the women who are between ages 45 and 55, who make about $50,000 a year in France and Italy, and you want to know the income risk that these two groups face. You are able to do with this statistics that we are publishing. So you can go really fine grain based on the needs of your project or the questions that you have. And finally, especially in some data sets in Europe and Canada and in some other countries, you are able to link across different administrative data sets. You can link a data set with income, with one in health and education, and you can get all these rich covariates for your analysis. So longitudinal dimension, what's the benefit? When you look at cross-sectional data sets, like the current population survey, for example, think of that. They provide static snapshots of the distribution because there is no dynamics. So you cannot really speak to what happens over time to the same individuals. And as I will mention in just a moment, that can be very important for welfare. A lot of welfare questions depends on what is happening to the same person over time. So panel data, for example, allows for studying the dynamics of income, the volatility, for example, or how skewed are the income shocks to an individual. You can also, with additional work, you can disentangle, volatility and get to uncertainty. And these are all dynamic concepts that requires a panel. Excuse me. You can look at mobility, both intergenerational and intragenerational. And you can also look at the probability of small probability events with big consequences. For example, extreme wage cuts versus extreme, wage hikes. The third one is probably one of the most important, because one thing that we have learned in the last, especially in the last 10, 15 years or so, is that income risk, income inequality, mobility patterns, they actually vary a lot. They vary a lot from cohort to cohort. They vary by gender, by education, even by the employer, the characteristics of your employer, and the permanent income, the long-run income status of individuals, by geographical location, and so on. So what we are trying to do in this project is to actually have this variation, to calculate some statistics for different cohorts, different gender, education, even for workers working at different types of employers, for example, distinguished by size, and calculate them for workers with different permanent income levels. So why is this important? I think at this point, it's hopefully, I gave a few examples, but one important question in understanding heterogeneous agent models is to disentangle ex-ante heterogeneity from ex-post heterogeneity. And with dynamics, you would be able to do that. With a snapshot, we cannot tell. The second one, for example, we want to understand how different groups in the population are affected. The income risk that they are facing is affected over the business cycle and in the long run. And these are all crucial inputs, if you want to do stabilization policies, redistribution, social insurance, and so on. So let me give you one example of, what kind of analysis you can do. So one important aspect of business cycles that, we are learning more about recently is that over the business cycle, it is not necessarily the variance of income shocks that varies a lot. Okay, the variance is mostly acyclical. It doesn't move too much. But one thing that varies is the skewness of income shocks or income growth rates. So suppose you are interested in this and you want to see how do these patterns look like across 13 countries in our study. Here I have, I couldn't fit all of them, but here you have 9 of them. So you have, for example, in Argentina, you can see how it's cyclical. You can see in Brazil, it's similar, but also a bit different. You can Canada, France, you can see all of them basically together. And then you get a sense about, for example, our Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, which we also have. Are they similar to each other? What countries are different and why? Suppose you are interested in inequality in the upper tail of the distribution and the lower tail of the distribution. Again, you can just plot all of them or a subset of them, and then you can see, for example, all these different patterns. Like the bottom end inequality, P5010, the red line here. In Argentina, it's flat. In Brazil, there's a big decline, right? In Canada, it's declining. France declining, but say in Norway, it's going up. So I hope this gives some, general idea about, what can be done with these statistics. So I want to conclude here and just note that currently the 13 countries in the project, we have 13 papers already written. And the drafts, you can go to this link, mabd.org, and it's the name of the project, Global Income Dynamics Project, and you can download and read all the papers. Thank you very much for listening. I'm now going to pass the microphone, so to speak, to Brian Bell, who is going to talk about the UK project.
Okay, great. Thank you, Fatih. I'm going to try and hopefully need to share my screen. So let's just do that. So hopefully you can see that screen yet.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So this is the UK part of the project. It's joint work with Nick Bloom and Jack Blundell at Stanford. The outline of what I'm going to talk about today is I'll very briefly describe the data. It's as described by Fatih, and then I'll present some statistics from the part, what's often called the part A of the project, which is a common core, which all countries have done the same sort of analysis for. So I'll talk through inequality, volatility, and mobility. And then I'll move on to our part B, which is where each country does a separate bit of analysis. And for the UK, we've done work on looking at how income varies with economic growth, so the sensitivity to the business cycle. And then we'll have something to say about COVID-19 recession. One of the advantages of the UK data
Brian, if I can stop you for a moment. Can
Yep.
you go full screen if it's possible?
Oh, yep, sorry. Let me just do that. Yep. Is that fine?
No, it froze, I think.
Oh, so I can see it in full screen.
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps if you first put in full screen and then share your screen, then it may work.
Okay, I'll try that. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, it works now.
The UK data is somewhat unusual in this project in that it's sort of a survey, although it's administrative data. And the reason it's sort of a survey is that the way it works is that every year the Statistics Office writes to all employers and asks them to tell them the wages of anyone who has two particular digits at the end of their social security number. That gives you a 1% sample that's a panel because that doesn't change. The advantage of the data is that it's legally required for firms to send the data back. So it is rather like administrative data in that sense. One of the strengths is it goes back a long way. So it goes back to 1975. So we've got 45 years of data. The other advantage, which we'll come to towards the end of the talk, is that it's very quick in updating. So the data relates to April of each year, and the data becomes available in October of the same year. So we've already got the 2020 data, and we'll actually get the 2021 data in a few months' time. So that allows us to actually do quite quick analysis, whereas quite a few of the other administrative data sets tend to be a few years before they get updated because they're based on tax records. We've got fairly standard variables. We're going to focus mainly on weekly earnings, which we're going to convert into annual data. And since 2002, we can match in firm identifiers as well. So we do some work in the paper looking at firm interactions as well. So let me just move straight on to some measures. So here's some measures of inequality. These will be, as I say, all projects have the same sort of pictures. So here's a picture of male earnings inequality since 1975, and you can see a pretty clear pattern up until the late the 2008 recession is a good sort of stopping point, where you can see that inequality was rising at all points through there, so the distribution was fanning out. One important thing to notice here relative to, say, the US, is that even at the bottom of the distribution, there was real wage growth. So these pictures are in real terms. So you can see that even at the 10th percentile, you got something like 20% real wage growth from 75 to 2005. So that's unlike the US, where at the bottom of the distribution, you saw wage declines. Since the Great Financial Crisis, there's been a gradual decline in inequality and very stagnant wages, actually no growth in real wages, some decline in real wages. That certainly hasn't come back yet. When you look at the gap between the top and the bottom of the distribution, you can see that actually it was driven over that period up until 2005. Both elements were driving. It wasn't that it was just the top moving away from the middle, it was also the middle moving away from the bottom. So both the distribution was widening on both sides of the median. Since the Great Recession, there's actually been a bit of a trend change in that the top of the distribution hasn't moved out any further. So we've stopped seeing upper tail inequality increasing, pretty much a flat line since the Great Recession. But we've seen some decline in the inequality at the bottom half of the distribution. That's disproportionately been driven by large increases in the minimum wage in the UK. So the minimum wage, as a deliberate policy, has increased in terms of its bite over the last 10 to 15 years. And you can see that really propping up the bottom of the distribution for men. For women, it's a broadly similar story. Two key differences. You can see that the widening hasn't actually been as big. So there is a bit of a fanning out, but not too much. And actually, growth has been much faster for all of the percentiles for women than for men. Of course, there's a big change in female participation over this period as well to consider. And then finally, since the Great Recession, you can see that actually women have recovered much better than men in terms of real wages. So actually at the bottom of the distribution for women, there's been an increase in the real wage at the bottom of the distribution. Again, that's primarily because they're almost all on the minimum wage in the bottom 10th percentile. And the minimum wage has explicitly been made to rise in real terms since the Great Recession. Again, you can see a slightly different picture for women in terms of the upper and bottom tails of the distribution. That the benefits of the minimum wage you can see in the top part of the picture, but actually it even predates the minimum wage. So the minimum wage in the UK came in 1998, and you can see that even before then we were seeing some gradual improvement in the bottom half of the distribution. The top half has actually been fairly steady for 30 years now. So women's inequality, the inequality in women's wages actually stopped rising at about 1990, whereas it carried on for men for another sort of 10, 15 years after that. We can also use the fact that we've got large samples and very accurate data to look at the very top of the distribution. And perhaps unsurprisingly, you're seeing that that widening of inequality is even more enhanced at the very top of the distribution. So you can see that the 99th and 99.9th percentile are really moving away, at least up until the Great Recession. Again, the Great Recession seems to be a point at which things start to go in the reverse, and actually there's, if anything, a narrowing of the distribution at the top. Just one point on this, we're using here weekly wages that we're annualizing. We do actually have annual wages from 2000 onwards. So if we want to have a picture that goes back to 75, we have to use weekly wages. If you use annual wages, the one thing you do find in these kind of pictures is that the levels of inequality are much higher. And that's because at the very top of the distribution, in capturing bonuses, annual bonuses is really important. So, you know, particularly in the financial sector in London, it's really important that you capture those. The trends are not actually enormously different, but the levels are much different. So this is underestimating, in some sense, the actual gap between the very top percentiles and the rest. Women's inequality at the very top is actually very similar. You see, again, a very big widening out at the very top. When we look at sort of broad measures of overall inequality, we've got two here, which is just the sort of the non-parametric gap between the 10th and the 90th percentile, and then the standard deviation of log earnings. You can see they move very similar pattern for men. Again, fairly consistent upward pattern up until 2008, and then fairly steady since then. But one nice thing we can do with this data, which again is somewhat unusual in the data set we've got, is that we've got quite accurate measurement of hours. Often hours aren't measured in these administrative data sets because they're tax records, but actually firms are required to report hours. And of course, because it's coming from the payroll data, it's actually going to be a fairly accurate measure of hours because they need to get that right to pay their workers correctly. It may, of course, not be very accurate for white collar workers, where you may, if they're not paid overtime, you may just get their standard hours reported. But we can decompose those earnings into wages and hours, and you get, for men, you get quite an interesting picture emerging, which tells a slightly more nuanced story. So the blue dotted line at the top is the picture we just previously had of the rising inequality up to the Great Recession and then flatlining. But actually, when you break it into hourly wage rates and hours of work, you can see that, interestingly, inequality in the hourly wage rate stopped rising actually significantly earlier. Sort of 1995 was the point at which we really began to flatline in terms of earnings inequality. But what happened for men was that the variance of hours began to rise quite significantly from that point on. So earnings themselves, total earnings, continue to become more unequal, but actually because there became more inequality in hours worked for men, particularly at the bottom of the distribution with fairly low hour work for some men, which is quite an interesting story. For women, of course, the hours story has been much more important over the whole sample. For men, it's only in the last sort of 20 years that that's become important. Female earnings inequality, you can again see that pattern of rising at the beginning, but then actually flatlining for the last sort of 30 years almost. And then we can also look at inequality at particular age groups. Again, given the sample sizes, we can hone in on inequality at different ages. And this picture is interesting because it points to inequality at the starting, essentially start of working life. So we've chosen 25 as a good point to illustrate that. And you can see that here there's a slightly different pattern, which is that inequalities just continued to rise for the entry-level wages all the way through until really the very end of the sample. So even though inequality, particularly for women, began to flatline a long time ago, actually inequality at starting wages has actually continued to rise. So the gap between entry-level wages has actually continued to rise. You can break that down into the top and the bottom. And again, an interesting story develops, which is actually that there's been almost no change over the last 20 to 30 years in entry-level wages in the top half of the distribution. There's been no increase in it. It's not that there are lots more people who are going off to work at Goldman Sachs earning an absolute fortune when they start. What's actually happened is the inequalities increased at the bottom of the distribution. In other words, there are far more people starting on lower wages than in the past. And so there's been a widening at the bottom of the distribution. I think this kind of highlights how being able to zone in on particular cohorts and age groups is a real benefit of this project, actually, rather than looking at the aggregate numbers. So just to summarize the inequality, we've seen steady increase in inequality for men up until the Great Recession, and that's now stopped. For women, it actually stopped sometime before, kind of 1995 was a period, and from then on, there's been fairly steady, no real increase in inequality. While top tail inequality has increased throughout the period, although mostly in the first half, but there's been a continuous rise in that very top inequality. Okay, if I move on to volatility. So for volatility, so what we've got here is just the 1 year earnings changes for men, and we'll have women in a minute. Just to be clear what this is no longer about where you rank in the distribution of wages. This is where you rank in the distribution of wage changes. So you could be at the P90th for the wage change, but actually be a low earner in total. So they're ranked by the 1 year change. And I guess the 2 points to note here are, first of all, as you might expect, the top half gets narrower in recessions. So it's much less likely you're going to get a large pay rise in a recession. So the P90 gets squashed towards the median. And in a recession, the P50, P10 rises because it's more likely that you're going to have very bad outcomes in a recession. And so the P10 widens away from the median. So that's as you might expect. There's been a pretty clear downward trend in this volatility over time. So you can see, particularly from about 1990 onwards, that's a fairly clear downward trend. So there are less and less extreme changes in the distribution of earnings changes. And then the thing to notice at the very end, which you almost have to rescale the picture to get in, is that because we've got 2020 data, we include the COVID recession, and you can see an absolutely staggering increase in the inequality in earnings changes at the bottom of the distribution. That's driven by the fact that the UK introduced a furlough scheme, which allowed people to keep their job, but at 80% of previous wages. And so all of a sudden you get a large group of people who remain in the data because they're still earning, but earning a significantly smaller amount than normal. And so you see this very big spike at the top. Actually, at the bottom, sorry. At the top of the distribution, this upper half, actually the COVID-19 recession was no more particularly interesting than normal recessions. There's a slight downward movement, but not much to talk about. Similar story for women. Again, you see the very big effect of the 2020 recession. Somewhat less clear. There does seem to be a downward trend in volatility from about 1990 onwards, but less stark than for men. So you wouldn't necessarily say that was a very strong movement down. It was much stronger for men than for women. For skewness, we can look at the skewness of those changes. Again, you can see, as you'd expect, that skewness goes down in the recession. And again, highlighting that very big change at the bottom in 2020, a very major outlier in terms of those skewness of the earnings changes. And then finally, we can look at the kurtosis of earnings changes. And here, kind kind of there's a slightly I don't know, unusual is the right word, but something that we didn't really expect, which is that certainly for men, you can see that there's actually an increase over time. So there's a trend increase over time for kurtosis. In other words, the distribution is becoming more leptokurtic over time. Again, the 2020 is a bit of an outlier. We've examined that just to see whether we can, one suggestion that we'd had was a simple explanation that perhaps there were changing composition of workers within men, perhaps less unionization, changing in sectors, and that could explain it. Actually, this is a pretty common picture however you break down by demographics. So it looks to be a fairly consistent pattern that actually wage changes are increasingly being centered around the mean, certainly for men, less so for women, although there is some trend increase in women, it looks like, from 1990 or so onwards. So again, suggestion, those two results together tend to suggest some sort of moderation of wage changes and a kind of a sort of an element of micro moderation, at least, in wage changes. And finally, before I move on to part B, the mobility, I've got a couple of pictures on mobility. So this allows us to look at how workers, because we've got a panel, we can look at how workers' income changes over time. So the way to read this is on the bottom, we've got permanent income, which is a 3-year average of wages. And then on the vertical axis, what that permanent income is 10 years ahead. So we can look at how people move. And the black dotted line is where there'll be perfect immobility. So you'd end up at the same place as where you started. And you can see, I guess there are two things to note in this picture, both for men and for women. You get evidence that as you age, as the cohort ages, you get more sticky in the distribution. So perhaps unsurprisingly, when you're young, you've got more chance of moving away from where you start off. You're further away from the dotted line, the black dotted line. As the cohort ages, you begin to tilt more towards the bottom line. So over the life cycle, wages become more sticky, permanent income becomes more sticky. And then we can also look at this over time, because we've got this advantage of having a very long panel. So we can compare 1977 with 2005. Again, we need 10 years after that to be able to work out where you are. And here for men, there's a pretty consistent picture, which is that mobility has tended to decrease. So the red line is further away, above and below the median. The red line is further away from the black dotted line than the green line. And so over time, mobility has decreased and your wages have become more sticky relative to your position in the income distribution. For women, that's much less clear. I think for women, the reality, you look at those pictures and you would say nothing particularly. There doesn't seem to be any clear trend there. But for men, a very clear picture of each decade getting less mobile. Okay, so that's just some statistics that we got from part A. So part B, I'm just going to finish off by talking about aggregate shocks and the COVID-19 recession. So what we're going to do to begin with is we're going to estimate some GDP betas. We're going to follow the approach of Fatty and co-authors from the AER. We're just going to estimate worker betas, which is simply how workers' earnings respond to aggregate shocks. So we're just going to run these the regression in the center there. We can do it separately. I'm only going to talk about weekly earnings, but we can of course break this down into earnings and hours to look at whether hours are responding or it's the wage rate. And we can interact that the GDP term, we can interact that with demographics to allow those betas to vary across demographics. And then in the final part of the paper, what we do is we use those betas to predict what we think the COVID-19 recession should have done to wages. And then we'll compare it with what actually happened to wages to see how well the model, as it were, fits out of sample, but also to see whether the COVID-19 recession was actually different. So here are some GDP estimates for earnings and hours. So I guess the two key ones to look at is column 1 and column 3 for earnings, and I'll just kind of highlight those two. For earnings, you can see a clearly positive beta, so workers' earnings do respond to aggregate shocks, but a reasonably small coefficient if you're used to American data of 0.38. So a 1% change in GDP causes a 0.4% change in earnings. Column 3, however, what we allow for is an asymmetric effect between whether GDP is rising or falling. So we're going to allow for a recession effect. And I mean, I think you have to be careful here. There are only 5 years of recession in our data. So we've got 45 years of data, 5 actual years when GDP fell, and the other 40 years GDP rose. So you're identifying off not many observations in some sense, but you can see that the evidence seems to suggest some pretty strong asymmetry here. that actually the GDP beta is much stronger when the economy is doing well, and actually there seems to be some protection of wages on the downside in a recession. So that's sort of quite interesting. As I said, the beta we've got, the raw beta of 0.38 is significantly less than Fatty and co-authors get for the US, where it's significantly bigger than 1 generally. We've had a look at why that might be the case, and I think we can broadly explain the difference, and I think kind of here's a few points. So the first is that our data includes public sector workers, whereas most US data sets don't include the public sector. If you get rid of the public sector workers, the beta goes up to 0.6, as you'd expect. Public sector workers are essentially isolated from the recession or from booms. If you allow lagged responses, so you don't require that there's an immediate contemporaneous impact of GDP on wages, you can, so you allow lagged effects, you can get significant and economically large things that add up to about 1. So you might take the view that, well, perhaps the UK is somewhere a bit more European than the US, and actually wages are a bit slower to respond and contracts are more important perhaps, and so it takes longer to reflect those GDP changes. And of course, union coverage is higher in the UK. Membership, not so much, but coverage is higher. And it's true that, that betas are higher for union members than for non-union members. So some of this might be that. Things that don't seem to explain very much is using annual earnings instead of weekly earnings doesn't seem to make much difference. We got that data for part of our sample. And we missed, as a technicality of our data set, we tend to miss very short-term job movers. But if we can adjust for that, we again don't find much of an effect. But overall, I think there's a reasonable understanding of why we get somewhat lower estimates than the US. Okay, and then in the final bit, I'm just going to use the estimate that we've got and the size of the GDP shock, which in the UK's case at this point was down 7.4%.
Brian, you have 1 minute.
1 minute, okay, perfect. So we're going to estimate that to predict what wages should have done in 2020 and compare with the actual. So at the aggregate level, our model would have predicted that wages would have fallen by 2.8%. And happily, or unhappily as it were, wages actually fell by 2.3%. So a pretty accurate estimate. But what we can also do is we can look how it affected different demographic groups. And so the orange bars there are what our model would predict. So you can see, for example, that men have more cyclical wages than women. In any recession, we'd expect men to do worse than women. And that was absolutely true in COVID as well. And actually, women seem to do better in reality than we might have expected. For age, again, a similar story. We would expect younger workers and very old, not very old, but older workers at the top to do worse. That was true in the recession as well. But again, younger workers actually did slightly worse than we might have expected. Earnings quintiles, again, we would predict that it's the lower half that does worse than the top half. Absolutely true in the data as well. And firm size, I think, is really interesting here. Big firms protect workers' wages in the recession. So we'd expect that to happen. And it happened, if anything, even more in COVID. If you worked for a large firm in the UK, you saw no wage reduction. You actually saw a small increase. And then finally, if you are unionizing in the public sector, that was, in some sense, the best thing to be in for COVID-19. Your wages, again, rose. Whereas even our model would have predicted a slight decline, but actually they were fully protected. Whereas in the private non-unionized sector, a big decline. So actually the model did quite well. And I think in that sense, this recession this time was no different. It was essentially what you would predict from previous recessions. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. We have time for a very quick question and answer if anybody has a question. I have one very quick, Brian. When you show the firm size effects on beta, the beta for large firms was small. So one thing that we found in the US was that's true. But if you look at high-ranking workers in large firms, their beta is actually very high. Your sample, I think, may not be large enough. But do you have any sense about that, or have you had a chance to?
I haven't, but our sample is actually, we'll be able to do that. So we can definitely interact. So that what do you use the permanent, their permanent position in the income distribution, sort of quintiles or something.
Yeah. So we look at within firm ranking in income, and you look at large firms. Large firms, most of them the beta is low, but it keeps rising with the rank in the firm. which suggests that, you know, they are like shareholders, so to speak, you know, like in the firm. And,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we can definitely do that. That's an interesting angle.
Thank you, Brian. Very interesting. So our next speaker is Youngmin Park, and from the Canada team.
Okay, I'll share my screen. All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Youngmin, and this is a joint work with Audra, Emilian, Huju, and Lance, and we are Team Canada. So in this project, we're going to use a data set called Canadian Employer-Employee Dynamics Database that covers from 1983 to 2016. So basically, it's a collection of tax and other administrative records. So we have everyone who filed their taxes in Canada. We know their age and sex, but we don't know their education. The key feature of this data set is that workers can be linked to their employers, but it can be done only after 2000. In the first part of the paper, we document how the distribution of earnings and earnings growth have changed over time in Canada. We have lots of summary statistics in the paper, but today's talk, I'm going to focus on two things, various percentiles of log earnings, such as the 10th percentile and median and so on, and dispersion of log earnings as well as earnings growth. So the overall dispersion is going to be measured by the difference between the 90th and 10th percentile, and that can be decomposed into the upper half dispersion and the lower half dispersion based on these percentiles. In the second part of the paper, we are going to show how this individual earnings dynamics is related to the size and growth of their employers. And we're going to look at workers who stay with the same employer, and people who switch employers separately for our analysis. So let me highlight three main findings of our paper. First, we find that earnings inequality and earnings dynamics didn't change much in the long run, but there are a few exceptions. First, gender earnings gap decreased. Second, inequality increased at the top of the distribution, it decreased at the bottom of the distribution, although the overall inequality didn't change much in the long run. Secondly, the earnings inequality and dispersion of earnings growth or earnings volatility vary substantially over the business cycle, and they rose sharply during recessions. The rising inequality during recession is mainly driven by the large drop in earnings at the bottom of the distribution, especially for men. And similarly, the high volatility during recessions is entirely driven by the greater downside risk in earnings rather than upside risk. Our third main finding is that earnings dynamics of all workers is strongly related to the size and growth of their firms. So workers at small firms or fast-growing firms experience higher earnings growth on average, and they face greater upside risk. In contrast, workers at contracting firms and those who get laid off by their employer, they experience lower earnings growth on average, and then they face greater downside risk. So before getting into the details, let me briefly explain what happened in Canada during this period. The left figure shows the real GDP per capita, and we can see that there were two major recessions, the one in the early 90s and the Great Recession. And the early 90s recession was particularly severe, and that's partly because of the tight monetary and fiscal policy. And we will see that this early 90s recession had a really big impact on earnings distribution. And this right figure shows employment rate for men and women. And for women, employment rate increased dramatically during this period, while for men, it didn't change much in the long run. And employment rate dropped drastically during these two recessions, and they didn't really fully recover afterwards. So let me begin with the first part of the paper. Here, this figure shows changes in various percentiles of log earnings relative to 1983, and these show separately for men and women. Three things stand out from these figures. First, we can see that male earnings grew more slowly compared to female earnings. Gender earnings gap declined. Secondly, we can see that male earnings are more sensitive to business cycle, especially those at the bottom of the distribution. So we can see that this black line, the 10th percentile, decreased sharply during this early 90s recession, and also during the Great Recession, but to a less extent. While the female earnings doesn't show as strong cyclicality compared to male earnings. Third, we can see that for both men and women, the median earnings, this red line, grew most slowly compared to other percentiles. And particularly for men, the median earnings and the 25th percentile didn't grow at all in the long run. And lastly, for men, the 90th percentile grew more than the 10th percentile, while the opposite was true for females. So this means that the overall earnings inequality, as measured by the 90th difference between the 90th and 10th percentile, grew a little bit for men and decreased slightly for women. And we can see that the most of the rise in earnings inequality for men is concentrated around this during early 90s recession. And as we saw before, it's mostly driven by the large drop in earnings at the bottom of the distribution. So we just seen that the overall earnings inequality didn't change much in the long run. But if you look at the inequality at the upper and lower half separately, we get a very different picture. Here we can see that upper half inequality, this blue line, increased constantly over time for both men and women, while the bottom half inequality decreased for both men and women. So there are some differences between men and women here. We can see that the upper half inequality grew more for men compared to women, and the bottom half inequality is more sensitive to business cycle for men. So now we move on to the dispersion of earnings growth. And we can see these patterns are pretty similar to the patterns of earnings inequality in the sense that we don't see a strong long-run trend, but we see strong counter-cyclicality, meaning the earnings growth dispersion increased sharply during these two recessions. And again, male earnings earning growth dispersion is more sensitive to these business cycles. For females, earnings growth is more dispersed compared to men, and it's less cyclical. So again, we can decompose the overall dispersion in earnings growth into the bottom half and top half dispersion. And we can see that the counter-cyclicality of this earnings growth dispersion is entirely driven by the widening dispersion at the bottom half of the distribution, while the upper half dispersion actually decreased during recession. This means that our earnings growth dispersion is negatively skewed during recession. So now I'm going to move on to the part 2, where we explore the role of firm dynamics in shaping earnings dynamics. So we know a lot about how earnings level is associated with the employer characteristics, but we don't know much about how earnings growth is related to firm employer characteristics. So that's what we're going to do in this paper, in this part B. We are going to, in particular, we're going to look at firm size and growth. And here we measure firm size based on firm size by number of employees. So for this analysis, we use the matched employer-employee sample. Again, that starts in 2001. At first, we assign individuals to their main employer that provide the greatest earnings in that year. And since we are going to look at firm size and growth, we exclude firms, employers that are too small or that are in a public sector. So we classify workers based on their mobility status. So stayers are the ones who have the same main employer in 2 consecutive years, and laid off movers are those who get laid off from the main employer, and non-laid off movers are those who switch their main employer without getting laid off. So here we measure layoffs based on administrative data on the reason for job separation. So we document 4 main facts in our second part of the paper. And here's the first fact number 1. The workers at larger firms tend to experience lower earnings growth on average. And we can see that this magnitude is substantial. There's about a 2 percentage point difference between the bottom and the top of the firm size distribution. And we can see that this relationship is mostly driven by the movers, these red and green lines, while it's mostly flat for stayers. And for non-laid off movers, they experience greater greater earnings growth. And in particular, those who move out of small firms get a higher earnings growth because partly because they are more likely to move to bigger firms that pay more on average. On the other hand, laid off movers, their earnings growth is lower compared to stayers, and those who get laid off by big firms experience a large earnings loss. And again, partly because they are more likely to move to smaller firms that pay less on average. So the second fact number 2, those at larger firms tend to experience lower dispersion in earnings growth. Again, the magnitude is quite large. There's about 0.25 difference between bottom and top of the firm size distribution. And that's larger than the cyclical variation of earnings dispersion, which is less than about 0.1. We can see that this relationship holds for non-laid off movers, but not so much for laid off movers. Okay, fact number 3, perhaps this is the most interesting fact. Workers at fast-growing firms tend to experience higher earnings growth on average. And we can see that these differences are massive. There's more than 10 percentage point difference in annual earnings growth between bottom and top of the firm growth distribution. And we can see that this positive relationship holds for movers as well, which is quite interesting because that means that workers' earnings are still related to their firm's growth after they leave the firm. So this suggests that there might be some worker firm soaring based on latent growth factors, or it could be driven by some local shocks that hit workers and firms at the same time. And you might think that this positive relationship between earnings growth and firm growth might be driven by mechanically driven by the relationship between firm growth and firm size, meaning fast-growing firms tend to be smaller firms, and we know from our fact number 1 that earnings growth is higher at smaller firms. But this is not the case for 2 reasons. First, when we construct firm growth groups, it's based on ranking within firm size group and year. And more importantly, when we look at this relationship separately by firm size, we can see that this positive relationship holds for every firm size group. Okay, fact number 4, workers at fast-growing firms and rapidly shrinking firms experience higher earnings growth dispersion compared to workers at stable employment. And we can look at whether this is driven by the upper half or the lower half of the distribution. And we can see that from this figure that this higher earnings growth dispersion at shrinking firms is mostly driven by the lower half dispersion of earnings growth, while at the fast-growing firms is mostly driven by the large dispersion in the upper half dispersion of earnings growth. So this means that earnings growth distribution is negatively skewed at shrinking firms, while it is positively skewed at growing firms. So this is kind of similar to our earlier finding that earnings growth distribution is negatively skewed during recessions. So let me conclude. In this paper, we use a rich administrative data to document how earnings inequality and earnings growth distribution changed over time over the past 4 decades. And our main finding is that first, the earnings distribution didn't change much in the long run, but earnings inequality between men and women declined over time. Earnings inequality increased at the top of the distribution, while it declined at the bottom of the distribution. Although the earnings distribution didn't change much in the long run, it varied substantially over the business cycle. In particular, the early 90s recession had a big impact on earnings inequality as well as earnings growth distribution. Earnings during the early 90s recession, earnings inequality increased, and that's mainly driven by the large drop in earnings at the bottom of the distribution. And also earnings growth dispersion increased substantially, and that's entirely driven by the widening dispersion at the bottom of the earnings growth distribution. The pattern was pretty similar for the Great Recession, but it was much weaker. Lastly, in the second part of the paper, we show that earnings growth is strongly related to the size and growth of their employer. And workers at large firms experience higher growth and lower dispersion in their earnings growth. And workers at fast-growing firms experience high earnings growth on average, and their earnings growth is more positively skewed. In contrast, workers at rapidly shrinking firms experience low earnings growth on average, and their earnings growth is negatively skewed. And this shows very similar patterns that we saw earlier about the cyclical patterns in earnings growth distribution. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Youngmin. This is very interesting. We have a few minutes for questions, if anybody has a question. I can ask one. The facts in the latter part, I think, are really interesting, and they are there's a lot of novel results there. One thing that I was curious about, so that when you look at fast-growing firms and shrinking firms, one issue is, of course, the selection, right? The workers who are in different types. And in principle, you might be able to identify that or control for that by looking at, transitions, in an AKM kind of world, to try to get like a fixed effect for a worker and try to understand firms that are shrinking in general. Are they dominated by workers with kind of a low worker fixed effect? And the firms that are growing fast, are they dominated by workers with a high worker fixed effect? Do you have have you ever thought about this, or have you ever looked at this? Because the question is it basically, the growth rate of the firm being transmitted to the earnings, or is it that, when a firm starts to go down, all the good workers leave, right? And so the remaining ones are stuck, and then there's a feedback loop. They also decline because the remaining workers are not so good.
I see. Yeah, so you're saying that whether this relationship between, so basically this relationship between earnings growth and firm growth might be driven by who leaves the firm when firm adjusts their.
Not entirely, but I think some of it could be due to that. And
right.
You've already done a lot in this paper, but I think it's going forward, it's an interesting question to think about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we haven't really thought about that. But we should definitely look at it. Yeah.
And one small comment I have, the picture that you showed about where you had two kings, so to speak. You know, the third figure from last, I think, where, you know, when employment growth is positive and large, right? The P9050 is the one that takes up. But when it is negative, actually, it's not a line. It doesn't decline, you know. Whereas for P5010, it is the opposite, right? In bad times, the P5010 opens up. In good times, it doesn't shrink all that much. Just to point out, actually, there's some, you know, on firms, there is an identical figure when you look at the firm productivity growth. That, you know, when in expansions, it is the P9050 of firm productivity growth that expands.
I see.
But in recessions, they don't shrink as much. And P5010 is the opposite. So it's the same figure with the y-axis for firm productivity instead of worker wages. So I thought that was because it's both about firms. In your case, you link it to workers, you know, income growth. And the one I'm mentioning is about productivity. So they're closely kind of related. It will be so think about it.
I see. I guess you're talking about the business cycle variation of this dispersion of productivity, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
so in your
that's
case, firm employment growth, right?
Right. Yeah.
You know, there's one that is, you know, at a more aggregated level.
Right.
It looks identical.
We actually looked a little bit about how the earnings, the patterns of productivity dispersion in our data set, and it's kind of interesting that the earnings inequality patterns, that the inequality increase at the bottom of increase at the top of the distribution and decrease at the bottom. We see a pretty similar pattern for a labor productivity dispersion over time during this period, but we didn't kind of do much about it. But I'll definitely look at what you suggested, whether see what it goes through. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so then we can move on to our last presentation by Bernardo about Argentina.
Thanks, Fatih. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you for the opportunity to present this work we've written with Andrés Blanco, Andrés Drenik, Chris Moser, and Danilo Trupkin. Actually, Drenik and Moser are here, so you can hold them accountable as well. So just to begin a little bit beyond the motivation of the project, some motivation of why we focus on Argentina. So these are two pictures about the cyclical point of GDP and annualized inflation rate. So we see first substantial business cycle volatility and inflation going from practically no inflation in the 90s to higher than 40% inflation, or at least 40% inflation 15 years later. So this provides a setting with a lot of macro variation, which can provide interesting developments in the labor market and subsequently in earnings dynamics and wage adjustment, which is what we're going to focus on. So specifically, in this project, we asked two questions. The first one has to do with how the distribution of earnings evolved in a period of changing macro conditions. And to this, we're going to use newly available data on labor earnings in Argentina and study trends and cross-sectional heterogeneity, especially as other projects just show inequality, volatility, and mobility between 1996 and 2015. And the second question has to do with nominal wage adjustments as Argentina moved from this low inflation scenario to a high inflation regime. And in order to do that, we're first going to develop a methodology to filter out regular wage changes. So like isolate permanent from transitory changes, and then use these to estimate or compute a frequency of wage adjustments across different groups of workers. So as Fadi mentioned at the beginning, these are very relevant questions, and their answers may allow us to understand a little bit better who are the winners and losers from labor market adjustments. and also contribute to quantifying which are the welfare consequences of aggregate fluctuations, particularly showing the large fluctuations we see in Argentina and in other developing countries, and also provide evidence about what are the potential costs of rising inflation in the current context, maybe not as much as in Argentina, but with rising inflation pressures, it may be interesting to see what are the wage adjustments implications, and finally contribute to designing fiscal and monetary stabilization policies, as well as distributive policies and social policies. So to preview our results, in case you have to run, we find in terms of earnings that earnings dropped significantly during the 2001-2002 crisis, except at the very top of the earnings distribution. But then after the crisis, earnings recovered quickly, mainly driven by the bottom of the distribution, leading to a decrease in inequality in this period. Now, dispersion decreased for men and women after the crisis, and our results suggest that when we look at earnings risk in Argentina, the measures are a little bit higher than what we can find in the US or Canada, that was shown at the beginning. And then we also find significant differences between formal and informal workers, not so much in terms of levels, but in terms of the dynamics and how responsive informal workers are to the business cycle. And then moving to wages, we find that the frequency of 12-month wage adjustments increased by 50% between the low and the high inflation periods. And there's substantial heterogeneity across groups of workers, but this heterogeneity becomes a little bit less pronounced as inflation increases, kind of compressing the distribution of frequencies of wage changes. And finally, perhaps not surprisingly, the distribution of wage changes shifts to the right, but becomes more symmetric, which has implications for real wage adjustments. So the outline of the talk today, I briefly describe the data and the macro context, and then I'll go through some of the results and end up with the nominal wage setting under alternative inflation regimes. So the main data set comes from Sistema Integrado Previsional Argentino, which is basically Social Security administrative records. We build, or the records allow for a matched employer-employee monthly panel. We are going to show you results from a 3% random sample today, which amounts to around 1% of the employment population, which is around 130,000 and 230,000 workers per year. Importantly, we don't have educational attainment or occupational status for this data, and we apply as standard in other projects some sample selection criteria. We are going to complement this data set with survey data from Argentina's Permanent Household Survey, mainly to look at, first validate our data with household survey data, and then also look at informality, right? So this is a rotating panel structure. We cannot follow workers for their whole job spells, but at least part of those. So to give you some context, I already showed you some charts about the macro context. So Argentina experienced a large recession in 2001, 2002, followed by a recovery. But then after the global financial crisis, Argentina didn't manage to go back to that growth path. And you can kind of see that in the formal employment rate, which increased substantially after the crisis, but they kind of flattened out around 70%. Now, behind this, happened some monetary regime changes after the crisis. So basically, inflation started to drift and reach a high inflation regime with inflation rates around 30–40%. And also related, the collective bargaining agreements gradually were reestablished after the crisis, together with the minimum wage schedules, which were increased as inflation increased, and that kind of pushed up wage floors in collective bargaining agreements. Okay, so this also relates to how different earnings across the distribution changed. So to go to the results about earnings, unfortunately, I don't have to explain all the charts again since my colleagues did that work for me. But if you look at normalized log earnings relative to 1996, which is the start of our sample, we see, as I said, a significant drop around 20% in real terms in the crisis, and then a subsequent recovery, especially in the bottom of the distribution. So you see the gray line of the 10th percentile of the distribution growing significantly, then kind of flattening out around 2010. But then if you look at the, say, 90th percentile, it took a little bit longer to go to pre-crisis levels. Now, this is a little bit different at the very top of the distribution, where workers didn't experience such an important drop during the crisis. So this is pretty important to understand. Probably there are sectoral compositions. We haven't looked at those in detail, but definitely something going on at the very top of the distribution. Now, in terms of inequality, following the crisis and given the large increase in earnings, there was a compression in the earnings distribution, and this was studied by Andres and Emilio in a 2020 paper, looking at how between firm income and mobility kind of contributed to this decrease in the dispersion of low earnings. This is mostly coming from both the upper and the lower tail, but if we look at women, it's mostly top inequality, and you can see that in the paper. For men, it's pretty much the same, but for women, it looks like top inequality explains most of this pattern. Going to earnings risk, and first, looking at dispersion of 1 year changes, the paper also looks at 5-year changes and permanent income, but here we're looking at short-term innovations. We see an overall decrease in dispersion over the period. Well, when you look at lower tail and upper tail dispersion, there's a negative co-movement with the business cycle, right? So you see the red line, which is a lower tail dispersion, kind of decreasing immediately in the crisis and then going up as earnings recovered. And then the upper tail, although it shows some cyclicality, mostly after the crisis, shows like a downward trend, although it is a little bit responsive to the business cycle. And this is, as Fatih showed at the beginning, really different from other macro contexts in other countries, maybe a little bit more stable probably. Now going to some moment-based dispersion measures, we look at the Kelly skewness and the Krause-Dickey kurtosis. So you see clearly skewness moving a lot with the business cycle, negative during recessions, and then going up during the recovery, and then oscillating also during the milder recessions after 2009. And then when we look at Krause-Dickey kurtosis, it looks like there was in Argentina, there was an increasing trend interrupted by the crisis, but then going up again starting in 2003 with not so much response to the business cycle, at least after 2009, or at least milder response, okay? Then we also look at mobility, 10-year mobility, as Brian showed for Canada. So we see upward mobility below the 40th percentile and downward mobility above it. Mobility is a little bit higher for young workers and slightly higher for women, but not so much. But we do see significantly higher mobility than what can be seen in the US from the work of Fatih and others. I'm not showing you this in here, but you can find it in the paper. When you look at 2000, 2005 mobility, the patterns are very stable. So there hasn't been a significant change, even though we're looking at short periods. It may have changed from the 80s maybe, but definitely not in the 2000s. So there's more in the paper, which I won't have time to show, but we show more men versus women decompositions, 1 year versus 5-year changes, age cohorts. There are some dynamics by age and earnings rank, also comparing results to what has been produced for the US. Top income inequality, which for Argentina is it's pretty novel, since as Fatih said, usually income inequality is analyzed through household surveys, so we cannot really see the top incomes in the distribution. And then we also analyze some changes in income shares, which you are very welcome to see in the paper, and send us any email if you have any questions. So now I'm going to briefly describe some patterns between formal and informal workers. So informality, I mean, this is pretty relevant in Argentina since informality is non-trivial, right? So in our period, informality is between 29 and 43% of the workforce, so pretty high, maybe not as high as in Mexico, but still. And household survey data allows us to distinguish between formal and informal workers. So going back to normalized log earnings, we see that there are significant differences between formal and informal workers. In particular, informal workers take much longer to recover from the crisis. So even 10 years after the crisis, they're still down compared to pre-crisis levels. Although, and then there are some difference also in how how earnings span in the distribution, but mostly it is this difficulty to recover after the crisis, okay? Now, when we see dispersion, in terms of levels, they look fairly similar, but there are some differences when we look at the dynamics. Also, we should note here that household survey data is not the best data to look at dynamics because we cannot follow workers through the entire job spells. And this may account for some of the differences, but what is clearly in the data is that formal workers seem to be more responsive to the business cycle when you look at dispersion of short-term innovations. Okay. There's a little bit more informality, but we'll leave that to the paper. Also, the projects, the Brazilian and the Mexican projects also look at this, so you're welcome to see those as well. Now, turning to the last part and exploiting some features of Argentina in terms of inflation dynamics, I'm going to tell you something about wage setting under low and high inflation. So to begin with, there's an issue of measurement, right? Like, so it's key to analyze inflexibility. Being able to isolate or distinguish between transitory and permanent wage changes. So the way we're going to do this is borrow a lot from the price setting literature and come up with a strategy to construct a measure of regular wage changes, which basically applies Lumita-Stevens 2020 break test in the following way. So this is a very qualitative description of the test. You can see the details in the paper, but basically what Stevens does is propose a methodology where you split the wage series into contiguous wage subsamples, and then you compare them in terms of where they can be coming from the same distribution, right? If these samples are drawn from the same distribution, if the differences between the distributions are large enough above some threshold kappa, then the methodology identifies a break, say in the permanent wage or in the permanent composition of the wage, and then conditional on there being a break, the regular wage is the median wage between breaks. Okay, so we're going to implement this strategy, also implementing some others from the pricing literature, namely Nakamura and Stason, Kehoe and Midrigan, and Blanco 2020. These are alternative ways of trying to isolate transitory deviations in price series. We adapt these to wages and compare them, and we conclude that Stevens is the one that performs the best, and you can find the details in the paper. Now, an issue is how to calibrate this threshold kappa, right? There's no obvious way to do it. So the way we do it is first we write a statistical model of wage determination where wages have a transitory and a regular component. And the model borrows some elements of a fixed cost and a Taylor model where there's a stochastic process for the wage. Then we estimate the parameters of this model using simulated method of moments, matching moments of the wage change distribution in our sample. This borrows a little bit from Bailey and Blanco forthcoming in terms of which are the moments we select, which are the short-term moments, short-term innovations and medium-term innovations. And then from this estimation, then since the model can, in the model we know which are the regular wage changes versus transitory wage changes. So we choose a kappa that matches the model behavior and then use this kappa to kind of recover breaks in the data, right? So it's a kind of a long process, but I hope, I try to convey the main intuition with it. So we estimate, importantly, since we suspect and the data kind of show there are significant differences across sectors, we estimate these kappas for each 2-digit sector, right? And then we'll show you some results for each sector in terms of frequency of wage changes. So before showing you the results and to build some intuitions, these are two particular wage histories from the data. So these are two workers, and we follow them over time and track their log wages over time. So you see a lot of seasonality, which mostly comes from the 13th wage. So Argentina pays a 13th wage, like in two parts, in June and December. So this explains a lot of that seasonality. So the methodology kind of filters that out together with other transitory deviations from the regular wage and gives us the blue line, which is like kind of if you were to trace and try to identify permanent breaks in the series, that is what the regular wage means, right? So it's kind of abstracting from all this short-term variability in the original wage series. Now, when we look at how much these regular wages explain in terms of the dispersion of total wages, they explain a significant amount. So more than 90% of dispersion in total wages are coming from the variability in regular changes as opposed to a transitory component. So to show you some of the results, remember we have two inflation periods. The first one is 1997, 2001, right? So practically no inflation, even a little of deflation by the end of the period. So in this period, 64% of workers adjusted their wage at least once in a year. So frequency is 0.64. That's what you can see in the left-hand side chart at the beginning of the series down there. And this is fairly similar to the US, right? It's around like 0.6, 0.65 frequency of wage changes in a context of low inflation, stable inflation. Now, when we go to the high inflation period, which we take as the 2007-2015 period to kind of omit the transition, first, inflation, of course, increased a lot, and average annual inflation was around 24%. And when we look at the frequency of wage adjustments, from 64, it goes up to 95. So a 50% increase, kind of, approximately. And when we look at the monthly frequency, kind of doubles, right? So significant increase in the frequency of wage adjustments. Now, we can see this at different levels of heterogeneity, right? So we could look at sectors or age. So before doing that, I'm going to show you some interesting facts about how the distribution of changes change between these two regimes, right? So under low inflation, around 34% of workers did not experience wage changes in line with average inflation, right? Which was around 0. Now, the mass is pretty asymmetric, also in line with previous studies. If you look at the, say, minus 25, 0% change bracket and compare it to the 0 to 25% bracket, there's a 24 percentage points difference. So pretty asymmetric, more concentrated to the right of the distribution. Now, under the high inflation period, first, average wage changes were more in line with average inflation. So 25% is the average wage change. Now, what's interesting is that the distribution becomes more symmetric. So if you look at to the left and to the right of the average wage change, the difference is only 4 percentage points. So this implies that in terms of in real terms, there is more prevalence of wage cuts, right? Which is important to, you know, how workers kind of fared in this high inflation period comparing to the 19th of the wage changes. Okay, so now, yes, going to different dimensions of heterogeneity, we compute different frequencies for different groups. So we compute age groups, earning groups, gender groups, and sectors. And now I'm going to only show you sectors. And you can see in the paper all the other results. So whereas in the low inflation period, we see significant heterogeneity across sectors in terms of the frequency of wage adjustments. So you see, for instance, agriculture about 0.8 compared to education, for instance, which is around, or trade, which is around 0.6. When we go to the high inflation period, this heterogeneity kind of dampens, and we have all these sectors kind of bunched together with more similar frequencies, right? So this provides we haven't looked at all the possible stories, but this provides, you know, a lot of richness in the data to try to understand what are the characteristics of these sectors, maybe different unionization patterns, different, you know, also skills composition. So there's a lot to look at in there, which we think it's pretty interesting for future work. So to conclude, since I'm almost running out of time, we analyzed the earnings dynamics and earnings inequality for the formal private sector in Argentina between 1996 and 2015. Our results indicate that earnings were stagnant before the crisis. They suffered a significant drop during the crisis, which was expected. But then, strong recovery ensued, mostly coming from the bottom of the distribution, which led to a compression in the income distribution or the labor earnings distribution. And our results suggest that there are significant deviations from the normal distribution, also consistent with results in the US and other countries. So, you know, this kind of points to some, being careful in how to calibrate some statistical models or stochastic processes when you look at income dynamics away from the normal distribution. Then we propose a new methodology to filter out regular wage changes, which we think can be useful for other researchers looking to also learn something from the pricing literature to how wages can behave. And we present some novel facts on the wage setting transitioning from a low to a high inflation period in Argentina. And in particular, as we showed, frequency of wage adjustments increased sharply, around 50% with high inflation. And there's significant heterogeneity across the groups, but with high inflation, this heterogeneity kind of starts to disappear, right? So as I said before, going forward, we think that looking at these margins of heterogeneity and also looking at the firm dimension, which we can't because these data do not have firm identifiers, so we're trying to access, data from the Ministry of Labor, which actually has these identifiers, so can allow you to disentangle, as in the paper with Andres and Emilio, some of the firm level margins that could be driving these differences in earnings across different working groups. Okay, so thank you very much. Back to you, Fadi.
Thank you, Bernardo. This was very interesting. I also come from a country where we had very long episodes of very high inflation. Right. So when you live through these episodes, you look at these data a bit differently. One comment I have, I think, is what you said near the end, which is the role of long-term contracts that are long-term. How unions negotiate multi-year wages, as opposed to workers who are not unionized. So sometimes it might be easier for a firm to change a few workers' wage, adjust it. But if you are dealing with tens of thousands of workers and a set contract, it might be harder. I think it would be very interesting to kind of have some insight into that.
Right. So in that respect, we looked at, actually in the data, you can look at, for instance, the education sector, which is mostly regulated. So unionization is very high, and there are actually wage adjustments every year. And then you can compare maybe to some other sectors like, like professional services or like software industry, where mostly, workers are not unionized and they kind of try to, negotiate their wages maybe on an individual basis or based on other dimensions of like skills, for instance. So definitely there's something to look at in there. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I was also wondering about the inflation episodes, so maybe more about the context. To what extent are firms able to anticipate inflation and anticipate how long an inflation episode will last? Because that might affect their wage setting.
Yeah, that's a good point. So actually, that could be interesting to see between the transition and when the inflationary regime kind of is more established. Like, for instance, especially taking into account that this collective bargaining process was gradually reestablished. So around 2010, firms really, anticipate, because you can see it in the press, and then politicians also start to discuss it around, which are the wage adjustments that unions have in mind to kind of renegotiate once a year. Now, in the transition, maybe this was more unexpected. So there should be some differences when you look at these different periods in terms of what are firms' expectations and how much they can anticipate those changes. But definitely an interesting point you're raising. Yeah.
Okay, well, this concludes our session. I'd like to thank all of you who joined through Zoom and those who are watching on the live stream. I mentioned at the beginning, just in case if you missed it, you can, let me actually put this up for a moment. You can find, there are 13 countries in the project, and there are 13 papers written by country teams, and they are all posted at the link that is on the screen. They all have, just like you saw today, every paper has, if you will, a part A, one part that is common to all the papers, and they are meant to compare some important statistics across these countries. And we saw some, about inequality, volatility, mobility, and so on. And the part B is, just like we saw today, some really interesting substantive question. And, they are out there for you to read. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Very interesting.
Bye.